It's nice to be here and nice to see all of you here in this lovely building that's been renovated and so much work has gone into. And I know, I have a lot of respect for the Hampton Bays Historical Society, because over the years, from when I was even in the Parks Department trying to help provide support for your organization to get a lot of the things you're trying to do accomplished, this group doesn't give up. They're very persistent. And Henry Moeller was my first town historian, and he was tremendous, just wonderful in all that you did and accomplished, and your commitment and dedication to the town of Southampton was extraordinary and was well beyond anything I had ever anticipated having as I entered office back in 2006. So I thank you and commend you for all of your work. And Barbara, you've been wonderful throughout the career. There's so many people here who have done so many things, and I just wanted to start out by just saying, this group has accomplished so much historic preservation in the town of Southampton, with this building, with the Prosper King House, with the Canoe Place Chapel. You were the people who created the first cemetery task force. And many of you, could you raise your hands, the people who were actually on that original task force? Okay. So we have 5, and there was so much work and energy that went into establishing that and becoming stewards of cemeteries, and you still today have, I believe, 3 cemeteries that you steward, and the Cuffey, the Foynia, and the Hubbard. And from that cemetery task force, it morphed into the town historic burying ground committee that we have today that Roger heads. And you, Brenda, still represent Hampton Bays there on that committee. And so many wonderful projects have grown out of what you all initially started. And I want to thank you for, coming up with that and putting all of that time and energy into it, because it really has made a significant difference in how we view our cemeteries and the historic information and the preservation that comes out of those today, and that's been documented, and the restoration work that's been done really all stemmed from this initial task force, as far as I'm concerned. And I want to, I just wanted to come here and thank you. And the projects that we're taking on now that we've gotten support from our administrations, several administrations that we've been through. Henry, I remember before I became town clerk, you had advocated for several things to take place, and I know there was the survey that was done with the University of Pennsylvania, and that was really the crux of the information that we started off with, because that survey of the 10 town historic cemeteries was really the foundation of what grew out of what we, that grew to what we do today. And also the purchasing of that camera equipment to document all of our historic holdings, so that we could preserve them, create reproductions to keep the originals safe and secure in our vaults while we would make the information available to the public. So that was another huge undertaking, and we've pretty much digitized everything that we have in our possession now. So I just want to thank you all and commend all of you for all of the hard work that you've done over many, many years, because it's unusual to find a group of people that continue on for so long. Richard, you've been tremendous, sharing all sorts of wonderful things that we have in our archives now from your family history here in Hampton Bays also, and we thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie Greene, who's our current town historian, who
big shoes to fill, Henry.
Big shoes, but you bring your own expertise and background into the town's historic division, which we created back in 2008. and we are so happy to have you.
Thanks,
and thank
Cindy.
you. Roger Tollefson, you have just done unbelievable work in creating these programs and electronic databases and making the access user-friendly so that we can expand these programs as you're going to show everybody into private cemeteries that have historic sections to them. So enjoy the presentation.
Thanks, Cindy.
So we're all here tonight to talk about our historic burying grounds, and to that end, so cemeteries are often valuable sources of historical information about the surrounding communities. From its age and ethnic makeup to people's day-to-day lives, all can be learned from gravestones. And these headstone styles and inscriptions and the symbols used offer clues to class, custom, and religion. In Southampton Village in the mid-17th century, early settlers established the Old South End Burying Ground. Headstones and footstones there from the 1680s coincide with the first and second generations of the settlers. As the population grew and spread out east and west of Southampton Village, additional burying grounds were created, from simple unmarked stones to elaborate obelisks, carved slates and brownstones, to marble and granite. Each represents periods in the settlement of Southampton town. Each is a record of who came before us. There are more than 50 cemeteries and grave sites within Southampton town, and 10 of them are town-owned. Sunday Schermeyer, our town clerk, recognizing that burying ground stones were historic records, just like our paper documents. They are sometimes the only document that somebody existed, especially for women. It's sometimes the only thing that has that they existed here in Southampton town. So we're very conscious of protecting these records, these historic records. They are now maintained and preserved through our Historic Burying Ground Committee, who Roger Tollefson is our chairman. Sunday is on the committee, as well as Brenda. I'm sorry? Marlene. Oh, Marlene, yeah. And we're working, our aim is to get all the information that's on these headstones saved, preserved, and so that the epitaphs and anything on the stones can be assessed for research. It's big genealogy time right now. To do this, the Office of the Town Clerk's Historic Division has created an informative website that Roger tirelessly working on. I don't know, what number are we at of unique hits on our website? 140,000 unique hits. And I go on it all the time, and it still only counts me as one. And we are working on a stewardship program. We enlist not-for-profit historical societies, other volunteers to look after the 10 town-owned that we have. So we're also now, our newest venture with historic cemeteries is throughout the entire town, the 40 cemeteries that are throughout the town, all of them have historic sections to them. And we are starting now to preserve and go and work with these privately owned cemeteries to get them to follow the same guidelines that we're working on. Because as a municipality, we are responsible for these cemeteries. So we may not all be around when good ground is abandoned, but eventually it will be full and it will no longer be taking interments. So the town eventually will take it over. So we're trying to get those records all preserved now. So 200 years from now, they'll be following the same guidelines. So we might as well start now so we can read while we can still read some of these stones. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So thank you very much, Hampton Bays Historic Society, for hosting us tonight. And I will turn it over to Roger, who is one of the most energetic colleagues that I've ever worked with, and we are having a great time putting this all together. And Southampton Burying Ground is a great place to start. So I'll turn it over to Roger.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks.
Yeah. First of all, we're going to position ourselves. Does everybody know what we're looking at?
I will stand.
This is the old burying ground.
Okay.
It was established originally in 1640, and it's located in the village of Southampton. That little spur of land that goes this way abuts the Little Plains Road. And with the exception of that, the only way to get access to it is a road along the bottom here, which is the old post road. So to position yourself, just north here is the Southampton Town Center. And you work your way down Little Plains to get to that. Can you do the next slide? So we're going to try to figure out what happened here. This gives you a little bit of history here. Back in 2002, the Town Landmarks and Historic District started to focus on conditions of some of the cemeteries we had here. And then the landmark status generated, actually was granted by the National Registry. They included the 10 cemeteries that are now considered historic in Southampton's and ownership area. And in 2006, with the encouragement, I believe, I'm not really sure of your role with that, actually, when you started to deal with it in the Hampton-based Historical Society, but did you push for that actual University of Pennsylvania survey? What was your role there?
The first thing that happened was in the landmarks and historic.
This is Skip Bowler, I'm sorry, yes.
In the historic districts and landmarks board. The landmarks board, I wrote a grant
Aha,
in the landmarks
Yeah.
board. And it was a question of funding originally, and there was no funding. And I wrote a check for it.
you started to contribute,
So
get the process going with your own
And when
process.
that happened, the landmarks board then hired Sac Student Law and the University of Pennsylvania, who came in and under the direction of the supervisor, town of Southampton, she coordinated, and
That's how it started. And the University of Pennsylvania has an excellent archaeological division, has set the standard for what you should do to maintain and to actually set up a structure to assure that what you have in the cemeteries can be documented and also preserved. So that happened in 2006, but when the survey was done, it was in the form of a disc. And the disc sat in the basement of the Town Hall records, and the public didn't have access to it. So when Hampton-based Historical Society was challenged to come up with a stewardship model back in 2007, the first thing that we started to do is how can we provide access to the public for that information? And that started our first website. And in the process we found there's all sorts of records that were not digitized. Digitized means they could be searched on the internet, you could do all sorts of nice things to it, but many of it was typically written in script, hard to read, and limited access. So, and Barbara was instrumental to this, Barbara Moore. She went back and she physically typed in, interpreted the signature, the script at the time, and she did over 3,600 records for the DAR 1936 survey. It was a phenomenal job. And then, of course, we had to check it. But in checking it, Barbara, I think we found 2 mistakes.
And Roger, if I could just interject, the way we funded that transformation of the information into a usable format was that Henry, as the historian, he donated his salary
Yes.
for that year, and that money was used to pay for the
And
services.
Barbara donated her time. So this
She
is very
donated a lot of
donation.
time.
It's a
Barbara
wonderful
was a-
model system.
Yes, it was.
Okay, so we developed the first page of the website in 2008. It was primarily to show off the content and the survey of the 2006 University of Pennsylvania. But then the Southampton Town Historical Burial Grounds Committee was formed. And the intention of that was to use the Hampton Bays model to apply for the rest of the town. So in 2012, we got our first recognized status. We have a resolution establishing the actual cemetery committee and authorized the authority and funding. And since that, we've been doing workshops and restoration. And the goals of the Southampton Town Historic Burying Ground Committee are to protect and restore historic graves, preserve and organize historic burying ground records, of which there's a lot more than we ever anticipated, make information available to the public, hence through the website, and encourage public education and involvement, which is why you're here today. The Southampton 10 historic burying grounds were ones that were, with the exception of 2, assumed by the town, because once a cemetery is full, there's no income. So what happens, it was left in disrepair, and eventually the town is in a position to take it over. The problem is that when it was taken over, there was almost no records associated with these things because people didn't do a good job with records. But you can see where we are located here. These are the 10 that the town owns. The 2 that are unusual here are the North End Burial Ground, which is located in Southampton as you go down Main Street. It's just on the right-hand side before you get down to Job's Lane, to whatever is Montauk Highway. But the first one that came about was the old Southampton Town Burying Ground. And what's unique about those 2, those were municipally set aside cemeteries. They didn't go through the process of being inherited by the town. They were created by the town. This is the resolution that opened and established our credibility as an organization, gave us the authority. And this is one of several resolutions which we asked the town to consider, and they did adopt, to give us to fix some of the loopholes in the operation of running a cemetery. which included who had the authority to do things, what does preservation mean, what controls can we take to make sure that we don't lose what we have. And so this is the first current edition of the website. I encourage you to go to this. It's much easier to give you a Google address than an actual address. Just type in Southampton Town Historic Cemeteries and you should pop up to this. Once you get to the home page, you can observe that there's many different links on the top to which you might want to express interest. In this particular case, we've shown all the cemeteries that exist in the town of Southampton. The ones that are owned by the town are underlined in blue, and those are 10. And the other ones, 38, are all privately owned and are not owned by the town. As you go along, you also can see under the search records a neat little feature here. I think it's probably the one that's most used. You can go to search the database and you get a choice of what you might want to select to look for, the name, the date, any kind of a word in a phrase which might be on the inscription. But in this particular case, I went back and looked at a stone for Phoebe Howell. And what you'll see when this shows up is the actual picture of the stone that was recorded in 2006 by the University of Pennsylvania. And it gives some condition report because the University of Pennsylvania report was about conditions. But it does give you some information. In the very bottom, you'll see what the actual inscription was read at that time. So it's very, very handy to find individual tracings of people that may have been in your past. You can also use the search records to search any text that we have on our website. And we have a lot of text there. In this particular case, we put in the word Macaira, and what happened is it came up to a restoration of Southampton's old burying grounds. If you click on that link, what will happen, you'll see the actual stone that was done in 2006, which was the condition report of the University of Pennsylvania. But you'll notice that we have done some restoration work on that. And in 2015, we straightened the headstone and also cleaned it with a solution called D2, which is a very well accepted cleaning agent, which every stone in the, every historic stone in the town of Southampton in the town-owned cemeteries has already been cleaned in this manner. So our purpose is, with this website is not only to give information to the public, but to also record all the attributes of a stone and anything that's been done to it while it's under our restoration concerns. So when we get back to the Southampton's old burying ground, we look at one portion of the cemetery. This is about a 2-acre parcel. And we say, well, this looks like a regular cemetery. What's the big deal here? But we turn around, if you look back to the northeast, you'll look over this wide open field with maybe 1 or 2 stones in the background and say, this is very disturbing. Something happened here. And when we compare it to other cemeteries, such as the Greene Burying Ground, which is located in Boston, Massachusetts, this was a cemetery that was formed about the same time. This is 1660, ours was 1640. They had 2 acres, and we do have 2 acres also in the old burying ground. Their number of interments was estimated to be about 2,300 plus. And in ours, based on the limited study we did with ground penetrating radar, we think there's 1,700. But the most intriguing part is that there's over 2,000 markers, while in our old burying ground, we have less than 48. So many questions started to jump out at us about the old burying ground. Why are there so few headstones? How many people are actually buried there? Have the property boundaries been changed over time? Because we felt that was true. Why is the Little Plains Road access so unusual? Most cemeteries look like a rectangle. This looks like a panhandle. Why did it have this? How could all this happen? So we started to do some early research. And we found out quite clearly from the trustees' records that the burying ground was set aside in 1640. We didn't know exactly where it was, and that was one of our quests that we'd have to follow. The old burying ground was filling to capacity within 100 years after that, and so in 1721, the North End Cemetery was dedicated. Once that was dedicated, people that were interred tended to go up to the north end of the town, and the old burying ground slowly was abandoned. And by 1864, a reporter looking to see if he could observe some of the headstones went back there, and he said it was densely covered with weeds and brambles. But he did find some of the stones. And then shortly after that, in 1883, Edwin Post enters the scene, and he was seen clearing the old burying ground. And this became a very contentious issue because even though it was abandoned, there were still people buried there, of course. And in 1888, Edwin Post's trial began in the Supreme Court. We started finding some disturbing news when we looked through some of the old papers. And the Brooklyn Daily Eagle was one of these interesting opportunities to see what was happening at that time, because many of the people that went to Brooklyn also came out to summer in the Hamptons. So this was a very interesting topic for people in Brooklyn. And they reported that the old burying ground had been desecrated. They put a pig pen there, there's a pasture field, there were cows walking around. And Captain James Herrick at that time was imploring the trustees to see that he was buried among his kin, but it couldn't happen because there was really no way to determine what was going on there. And Mr. Post was seen carting away thousands of loads of loam, which had covered the tops of graves, and he used this to fill in some of the low places on his property. So the trustees, when the trustees were informed that the graves were leveled, with the moss and tombstones with the moss of ages on them had been thrown into a ditch, they finally started to initiate a settlement with Post, which eventually led to the summons in 1887. So before we went any further with our research, we said, let's see what's under there. So there's a great technique called ground penetrating radar, which is similar to what you might know about in a boat that has sonar. You can look down and see where the fish are. Well, this type of device looks like a big lawnmower, but you slide it across the top of the surface and you can actually see down below. And you'll see disturbances. We weren't necessarily seeing bones, although we perhaps could have. What we actually saw was the disturbance of the shovels that were made to dig out the actual graves. And everywhere we looked, we found that there were marks and indications that the ground had been disturbed. And there were some interesting things about it, because the depths varied from 4 to 6 feet in depth along a 30-foot scan line. This gave us just a baseline to determine what was actually there. So then we went back and looked at the overlay of the ground penetrating sample surveys we've done on the map. And based on that, there was about 50 stones per track across the northeast sector. And it came out to be about 1,700 unmarked graves. If that's true, this represents at least the first and second generations of the founders of the town of Southampton, and perhaps even more. So in the results of the ground penetrating radar, we found that the graves were systematically laid out in rows. Somebody was in charge, they just didn't happen this way. Somebody must have laid out the plots and assigned them. The plot size varied from 4.5 to 5 foot to 10 feet west to east, which is typical of many cemeteries, although the depth of 5 feet indicates that the burials were done a little bit deeper than normal, which implied that a layer of fill had been laid down, which is consistent with what the observers had seen back in 1887. The gravestones had been moved. In fact, we found very few of the stones that matched any of the actual dig marks below them, so it indicated that they were removed at one time and put back later. And graves were found everywhere, even beneath the hedges that bounded the properties. But there were no fallen stones in the entire graveyard, and graves were also found in part of the Little Plains access road. Just to get a feel about the systematic methods which were used to go back and to lay out cemeteries, other cemeteries, this is not the old burying ground, but other cemeteries did have plot grid maps, and most of these have some over the years ceased to exist. But this is what we feel may very well have been represented under the old burying ground. Now we need to go back and try to reconstruct some of the things that led up to this trial. In 1640, the trustees had designated 1 acre of land for the burying ground, and it's to be set back from Main Street. It wasn't very specific of where it was, but we do know it was set aside. In 1684, they had the first divide of the plains. Now remember, the settlers, when they first came out, they didn't own any land. And as the trustees got together, they, based on merit, they went back and gave the individual settlers a lot, or what they call a 150-pound lot, or some piece thereof, that they could use to assign, to choose plots that had been laid out by the surveyors, in this case along the first divide, which is on the south side of Main Street. In 1659, there was another divide called the second divide, and that was along the west side of Little Plains Road. And by 1665, Herrick got involved because there was the first church, or the second church, that was located on South Main Street, was probably the area where many services were held, and it was logical for people to go from the church to the burying ground. And that was trespassing over what was then Herrick's land. So what he did in 1665, he gave a right-of-way about approximately 20 feet from South Main Street to the old burying ground. In exchange for that, the town gave him 1 acre, which was located somewhere in the back by the old burying ground. Again, we didn't know where that was. And in 1721, the old burying ground was filling up, so the North End Cemetery was dedicated. The first grave that was used in the North End Cemetery was by Joseph Post, a relative of Edwin Post, and he died at the age of 72 in 1721. And the footstone still reads, "The first interred in this place." So we started to go back, and after we did the GPR survey, we attracted some attention. One of our goals is to go back and to have the public be aware of what we're doing. The New York Times came out. In fact, we were featured in 7 Associated Press throughout the United States with that GPR survey we did. So we got some good PR on it, and we attracted the attention of the New York Times. And they went up to Riverhead Supreme Court, and they found the original trial records. We hadn't looked for those yet at that point in time, but they went up and took copies. And they found out that this was the day it started, and the trial went back and said that Edwin Post was wrongfully entered onto the premises and let his horses and cattle go back and bend up against any kind of structure that would easily knock over a gravestone. And hogs, they had hog sheds there with pigsty, and he trampled down the graves and disturbed and injured. It's a horrible indictment, but that was what he was charged. So part of these maps here came from Edwin Post's trial. Some of them were submitted by the plaintiff, and some were from the town. And this shows the actual homestead. The east road is Little Plains Road. That's the one that comes down from Southampton Town Hall going down to the beach. And then this side over here, at this corner, would have been Main Street. So it's quite a distance between the two. It's almost like 2,000 feet. But we're looking at and concentrating on now is the center section over here. But all this has to be evaluated because one of the things we came up with, is the next picture here, is that with all this information, Post went back and maintained he owned the property, and it wasn't the town's at all. He maintained that it was his cemetery, and it was always his, and there was only 1 acre that the town had because the only record they could find in the public records was the town had set aside 1 acre. What we found out later is because the town owned the property, when they did the second divide, they never ever had to assign that because it was already the town's. That's why there's no reference to it. And what they left over was 2 acres, but he was saying it was only 1. So we went back and take a look at some of these details that they had in the next map. And one of the questions we had here after the whole trial was over was the penalty. The penalty was for trespass and 6 cents. That's what he got. Now there were court fees to pay, but I mean, what a slap in the face. I mean, 6 cents for what he did. Because there were witnesses there, it was tearful. There were family members coming up and said it was disgraceful. I can't find a spot where my mother and my grandfather was. It was unbelievable. Next page. So the trial raised many perplexing questions. If the gravestones weren't dumped into a ditch, as was reported, could we find the ditch? Okay. Why was the well so important? They mentioned the well in this thing. A well. There's a big dish about a well. They had to move it. What's going on here? We were trying to figure out what's happening here. And could we rely on the trial surveys, which I showed before, if they had been done after the burying ground had been leveled? In other words, the markings on the edges of the property line were obliterated, except for the north, which was Powell's property at that point in time, common properties that he would have disturbed. But the other side were obliterated, and then the maps were drawn. So we didn't know where the original property lines were. And if there was a ditch to be filled in, it was the ditch before he covered them over. So we had to find the ditch. Okay. So, ditches. We know sometime, we don't know the date of this actually, it says that around 1665, this piece of property here, 220 by 350, was what this author had determined to be the burying ground. But the key word is that after the division of the common lands, which was the second division, around the burying ground, each one adjoining it, every neighbor, to hove a ditch on his line by digging a trench, the burying ground which stands to this day. So there's the first reference to the ditch. And there's the first reference to the fact that it wasn't 1 acre, but 2. So to understand the burying ground, we had to reconstruct the original land grants because we had no actual reference, because the lines were obliterated, to know where the original ditch was. We had no idea where to dig. So what we did, we chose a rectangle of known dimensions, which was Meeting House Lane on the north, Tulsa Lane on the south, South Main Street on the western boundary, and Little Plains Road on the east. And we needed a way to check the results. So, in 1894, Beer went back and produced a map of Southampton. But what we're going to be looking at here this, to put you in perspective, Agawam Lake, we're coming through here. There's the cemetery. And we had two main roads, Tolson Lane, and we had Main Street. Tolson Lane and Main Street. And so we wanted to look and see if we could somehow reconstruct that. And there it is, a larger expanse. Tolson Lane, out since that, there's Post Lanes and Herrick Lane is there. But we knew at that time, this was after the first divide and second divide, we knew that that was the dimensions. So, went back and we looked at the town's public information center, which is a great resource. You can look this up, and there's great tools. You can measure areas, you can do rectangles and lengths and whatever you want to do. So I simply went back and said, let me draw a line between this rectangle and see what the dimensions are. And we came up with some dimensions which were pretty close to what it was at the time, except that the road was expanded a little bit in dimension sometime before that. And we found out there was a north-south division line. You see the map turned a little bit. There's Little Plains Road, Tolson, South Main Street, and Meeting House Lane. And it's pretty clear that this was the first divide, that was the second divide. So everybody got, well, when they did the first divide, they went back along South Main Street. The people that were most prominent got 150-pound lots, or maybe multiples of that. But it was based on whether they were important for the community and whether they had to work the land. If they didn't work the land, they had to leave and give up their property. So the east side of South Main Street, a 150-pound lot was a 4-acre parcel, pretty big. So the north-south line was arranged. So that meant we knew that the 4-acre lot was. We knew how far it was back to the back lot line. So we knew the frontage. We calculate the frontage. So we did that. On the west side, they didn't have that because it was kind of like angular. So they gave them frontage until it came to the back line. It's a little confusing, but let's see what happens here. So from this dimension to here, we knew that property was laid out in 4-acre pieces if they had a 150-pound lot. Not everybody did. So that meant a 150-pound lot that was 900 feet deep would have an entrance, an access on South Main Street of so many feet. It's simple math. So we're going to recommit. We knew that was there. The burying ground was, we think was over there someplace, but weren't sure. So we went back and tried to figure out if we could reconstruct this. Now, well, this is in Southampton Village. If you go to the Southampton Village Historical Society, you will see this layout of this map. This was done by Pelletreau back in 1864, something like this. And it documented rather convolutedly, but it does show the next picture. That this is along Main Street, South Main Street here, and it documents the original owner to the current owner. So this particular plot, first, second, third, fourth, for instance, was originally granted to Elias Cook in 1848. And then over the years it was sold, or maybe just divided. But we knew the top line represented the owners of those particular plots. So from that, knowing what, there was also a record of what each owner received in terms of his 150-pound lot, so we knew how many acres he received, we were able to reconstruct the entire size of the eastern part, the western part of the North Divide. And that's what it looked like back before the second divide. And there's the church lot. Today all that's there is a sign that says the second church lot, but that's what it was. So we still don't know what the burying ground was. We had to figure out the other side. So now it gets a little tricky. That's when they built the second church right there. And then what happened is, because the church was there and the burying ground was there, if you had a ceremony, you have to walk all the way around, to the next row. So Herrick, who owned the property here, went back and said, I'll let you go along my property line if you give me an acre over here, behind it. And we didn't know exactly where that was. But we know that the right-of-way was there, and we know that Herrick got an acre. Next. The Book of Records by Pelletreau went back and said, okay, here's what everybody got when they went back through the lottery. They were given a lottery. We said, what lot do you want? Well, I want lot number 3. It's 4 poles and 1 foot. Well, a pole is 16.5 feet. So that's 4 times that, and a foot would tell you how much of a frontage you had. So we could work our way through. What was also important, even though you had the frontage, if you had a 50-pound lot, it would only be short. If you had a 150 lot, it might be deep. So we had another 2. Next. This is what came up with. This is a PowerPoint presentation, but this is an Excel spreadsheet. So we were able to go back, and using Pelletreau's records, we found the lot numbers. We couldn't read all the numbers correctly. Some of the reds we weren't sure about. We then simply take the poles times 16.5 plus the feet is the total frontage. We knew what lot size they got. That was very difficult because they were trading lots, they're giving it to their friends. Somebody got a 50, somebody combined it with somebody else. And that determined that the lot depth for that particular property with 115-foot frontage was 754 foot deep. Now, it had to be no more than that because that would have butt to the north division line.
I know Roger keeps saying we, but it was really Roger
Well, that's
that
okay.
figured this all out.
So what we did, Julie went back
And
and found the original handwritten records. They look like a piece of onion skin, you can't read it. But because they took the Photoshop of it, we took a picture of it, and then Photoshopped it, we could make out a little bit more. And from that, we could see, for instance, Samuel Dayton, the very, very flowing, with a number 10, we can clearly see that's number 10. We can kind of make out the 2 rods, and the C3 is unknown. And there's all sorts of unusual things which we couldn't quite figure out.
right. And we were able to, sorry, William, Mr. Pelletreau, we were able to find where he trying to read this without the advanced technology of Photoshop and zooming into something to make it, one word, 10 inches big so that you could really read it. He did make some mistakes, and we found them, or we're trying to figure out the corrections, and yeah.
These are the mistakes. The ones in yellows are the mistakes.
Mistakes.
Pretty good. Not as good as Barker. But pretty good. And what happened, we were able to go back and put these together in a format so that the frontage of the area of that rectangle, the original rectangle, we knew that rectangle had about 1,600 feet. So we added up those, we knew the starting point, the ending point, and we knew who was in what order. And not over there, see that circle in the very part there? The 343.7 feet? That's unusual depth, because the depth was almost 700 feet to the north line from Little Plains Road. That meant only about halfway. The other half was the
Burying ground.
Okay? Did I lose everybody? Okay. So we were able to fill everything in. So now we got what we think was the original results of the first divide and the second divide. We know that it was 2 acres expanded by default because the trustees never gave the second acre away, they just included it. But we also found that the owners of the front were Thomas Vail, Richard Post, and Thomas Burton. And we could identify Herrick's 385 with that peculiar angle, but that's what it seemed to show. And we show the right-of-way going back into the property. Next one. So this is the whole picture here, but we found out that it didn't make sense when you actually worked out what happened with Samuel Dayton and Joshua Barnes at the bottom there. So it really was a rectangle tied with a flag lock on the back.
Right.
That's what we concluded, but for just because everybody else is showing it in all our records, we're going to continue to show that.
We found that Samuel Dayton came later into the town. He was actually an East Hamptoner, and he came in and he had to prove himself. So he got he didn't get quite a big a lot as some of the others.
In addition,
So
he
it's,
had many trial cases.
he had his own problems with.
So they kicked him out after a few years, and that property reverted to either to Barnes or to Herrick. I'm not sure who took it, but we're still looking at the original setup.
Yeah.
So that's what we think happened. And the green area, the light green area, that represented something which occurred 210 years ago. Post had acquired all that land. Not the middle, which is the 2 acres, but everything around it was purchased by Post. That is his homestead. So what we did, this is a big example of it, and that was the actual status of the homestead in 1988. The names were only representing the names of the original owners 200 years prior. So what we did, we superimposed, this is the map that he gave a trial in 1888. Edward Post's trial showed this as his homestead. So we superimposed that map on the map we created, and that's what we got. That's pretty darn good, right? So you can see that the burying ground's there. You see that one of the lines doesn't seem to mix up there. But that's where the road is going to come in sometime in the future. And we see this unusual line on the far there. Can you see it between Thomas's Vales? There's an angle there that doesn't make sense. What is that doing there? So let's go to the next one. So we needed to focus on the eastern part of the homestead, this would be that north divide between the first divide and the second divide. We wanted to focus on that because somewhere in there was the original allocation on that top spot for the 2 acres of the cemetery. So not here. So we had the ground penetrating radar. So we took that map and superimposed on the one from This is also
Post-trial.
from the trial, and we found out there was a very good, excellent correlation. So we're pretty sure that we had the dimensions on this side, and this side, and this side, but there was something screwy over there. It's not even a straight line. The original settlers loved straight lines. Next. So with all this stuff, we found out that the red line was actually true north. I've been showing everything as north as the top of the map. We're all used to seeing that. But that's true north. What's that make the rest of it? Well, we think what happened was that when they gave the first acre, it only was that little piece of the burying ground here, and everybody was supposed to dig a trench. But because it wasn't quite yet infringing on their property, I don't think Vail, Post, or Bennett dug the trench. They put posts in there. Posts were the way they marked it. But as people started growing out, they wanted a clearer definition of the property line. So what happened is that one night, they were both, some of them were sailors, they all had compasses. You had to use a sextant. One night, probably the three of them said, let's not dig our own trench, let's all get to dig our own, one trench in common. So they got a couple beers, maybe the post,
Ales.
maybe the Vail Richard post was gone, and maybe the only post was the one right there. So they stood there, and unlike the original founders that would have used a compass, they were at night, maybe they were ashamed to do it at night, I don't know, and they looked at the North Star, and they drew the line. So they drew the line, and that represented exactly 344 feet at that point, but it made this distance too short and that distance too long. That should have been 344, that's 363. And that became 342 at that point. Now, what does that mean? They didn't know at that point in time, it wasn't until 1701, that anybody, including the Navy, which was dependent upon this, of Britain, that there was such a thing as magnetic north. They didn't know this. And they didn't know it moved with time. So when this was actually discovered, we can determine by the date line in 1640, which is the time, that the offset was 8 degrees west of north. We don't have to make any history. I just do this with slide right there. There's a website, you go there. So it's 8 degrees west of north. Next one. So the magnetic variation changes. You can go by time, and you can go back and say what happened in 1920, 1960, and it goes. It's 9 degrees north in 1887, so it moves. Next. So there's the north. At that time, it was 8 degrees west of north. Now what's that line over there? This is the Google map showing, lining up with the true magnetic north, which was the post line, and shows everything at an angle. But everything is going to be moved to compensate for the true north, which shows this. This is the map of Southampton Village, which is not straight up and down, it's at an angle. It's 8 degrees west of north. So because of this offset, that means that every street south of Meeting House Lane in the village of Southampton was lined up with magnetic north, not true north, with the exception of one property line, and that was the eastern property line of the old burying ground. So the next question we had to deal with is, what's with the Little Plains Road access way? Because again, most cemeteries are rectangular. This looks like a panhandle. And why was it so large? So we went back and looked at the records, and we found that in 1769, Joshua Rogers did go back and comment to himself and his heirs that the people of Southampton Village will have the right to go back and walk over their property with probably a 20-foot, doesn't say it, but a 20-foot access way on the north property line to the cemetery. We don't know what the transaction was, but it was given. Next. So because there was now access from Little Plains Road, Post blocked and claimed the main right-of-way that came from Herrick's, that Herrick got a full acre for, and he claimed it for his own. And he took it over. He usurped it. Okay. So in 1892, after years of negotiation, the trustees demanded that since Post took away the Herrick's right-of-way and a slice of land to clear the well, which we'll talk about next, they went back and said, this is 900 foot long by 200 by 20, so that was 1,800 square feet. So we want to get back not just that little 20-foot piece, we want a piece which is equal to 18,000 square feet, so it's going to be 54 feet wide. That's why that piece is now 54 foot wide, okay? Now the next thing that happened here is that part of the deal was he had to clear the well. What the heck did that mean? had to move it 2 feet, his property line, to the east. Remember that 342, that crazy angle, 342 versus 344? That's the 2 foot. Next. So there we are. We got this piece of property which he claimed, and then we got the Vale property right over there, which is originally Vale, but was that point in time was Joshua Rogers, I guess, became 54 feet. That's why it's such a long, it's not a road, you can't figure out what it is. It's because that area equaled this area. And then the line on this had to be moved back 2 feet because that was 342 feet as opposed to 344. Aha, the well. Next. I said to myself. We found a map. Originally it was folded. We didn't see that little thing on the bottom there, on the bottom right. It says well. W-E-L-L. It wasn't circled in red. We did that. But this was the property that Post claimed. This is the old burying ground, with the exception of the piece going out to Little Plains Road. So we said, aha, let's see what happens. Then we went back, and this is the actual point where it says that Mr. Post is to remove the well in the burying ground, to abstain from pasturing or from carting any farm produce over the land, no fertilizers, that sound familiar? No fertilizers, over it, and to remove certain fencing, which he already fenced, lying on it. And Mr. Post refuses to act on this order. He's going to take legal measures to do so. He was stubborn. He wasn't going to give up anything. Next. So what's the significance of the well? It was on the property ditch line, which is the property line that was most likely the one that was buried over, which may have been the one that people saw him throwing the gravestones in. We don't know if it was intentionally built on the burying ground or not, but Post was given an opportunity to move or bury it. Move it. In fact, moving became an article in one of the papers. How do you move a well? But it was an option. The question is, what was the well made of? Now, we don't know when the well was put up, but because we're removing all those stones, it would seem logically that a little footstone would be exactly the thing you'd want to use to build a well. If we could find that, that would be something. And said, did he really remove it? Only more questions. So we go back. This is the crew. Those are probing rods. They're fiberglass, so when you go back, you don't hit under electric wire and zap yourself, but it's a lot of work. You can cover a little bit of ground, but not a lot. And this is the property line, the property just east of that hedge line is the east line of the old burying ground. And we were looking to see if there was some way we could determine where the trench was actually beforehand.
I can't use my arms for days.
No, it's hard work. Sometimes you have to hit it with a 2x4 to get it started, then you get through down. And we found that an interesting thing is that about 2 feet down, there was a layer, a natural marker layer of gravel, which was there from who knows when, maybe the last ice age. And what happens is when we hit that, you thought you had a gravestone. In fact, the first time we did it, all those blue lines indicated we thought were something that were gravestones. Sunday I thought was going to have oh my God. But then we found out we could punch through it. And that actually represented area that was not disturbed. But by default, if we didn't hit something at 2 feet, we could find something that was disturbed. Next. So was the well moved? Now we're looking, this is the east line. This is the south corner right there. And when we did the original survey, we weren't looking for it with the GPR survey, but we could found a consistent level of graves except for that corner. And that's where that well was. So we think something happened in that area, but we didn't find the well. We expected to see a big 6-foot circle and a clear, I am the well, but it wasn't there. So let's see. So what we did to this point in time, we reviewed the trial records of every post. We combined them with the trustees' records, reconstructed the family's land divides. We added the new surveys, which the town resurveyed for the first time in 2000, I guess it was 16. We tried ground penetrating, and we also did the ground probing with the GPR, and now we put it all together. Here's what we got. This was an aerial shot from 1930, just to show you how little development there was in Southampton Village. That is clearly, we didn't embellish this, but that's clearly the old burying ground. And see, there's no houses around it. It shows part of the homestead going back to West Main Street, to South Main Street, and that line going down vertically is the Little Plains Road. Next. So what we did here, this is a Google map showing the same thing. See what the development has brought to us now. But the lines are pretty much the same. And we thought it was unlikely that this line here, which was border to Howell, would have been influenced. I mean, your neighbor wouldn't have allowed you to fill the ditch in. I mean, that was something. This line here could have been, it was variable because there was 20 foot allowed for a road, and the road is now over Post Lane. So we had the GPR guy go over the road, finding nothing. I mean, we didn't find a rock. We didn't.
Sweating that one.
Yeah, I know. If we found it, that would have been very interesting. But it wasn't that. So it's either this one or this one. Now this one is an interesting situation, but we decided because of everything being moved, let's explore that. Next. Here's what we conclude. This is now that eastern property faced north, so I could show it to you. This up this direction is north. This is south. That's the southeast corner. That was where the well was marked on the map. Those are the graves, and we found graves along that line. Just the little dots below the green line there, on the top there. That meant to me one thing, that if he had to put a new ditch in, he wouldn't have allowed people, if people built to that ditch after he had dug it, there's no way he would have destroyed those graves because everybody was looking at them. I mean, this would have been recent burials. So it had to be before. So the ditch line had to be on that side of the graves, and it had to extend to a point at 342 somewhere in there. So we think the original ditch was the green line. The only problem with that, it's under the hedge. And then the orange one is the hedge line, and the blue line would have been the exact 342. Because when the guys went out there with the sextant, this dimension here really favored more towards it increased the size of the burying ground. So it was not, they didn't do it for any purposes other than it was a mistake. So that's where we are today. And what do we have to do now? We've got to do continue research for records. We're finding new things every day. Julie's coming up with stuff. I don't know where she gets it, but it's been unbelievable. And we're putting it in catalogs. We're putting it on the website, trying to tie it together. We're looking what must have been available at one time, the old burying ground burial ledger or plot layout that was sometimes done. It was clear because what we have is a clear rectangular. That doesn't happen by choice, just by chance. The only problem, the people that would have been in charge with that are the trustees. And Eben Post was a trustee. So we don't know what happened, but it certainly would not be to his advantage if that was found, because that would document everything that was done. So we're asking for help from descendants of early settlers. We have about 60 families that were the original settlers that represented the 1,700 graves there. It was the first and second generations of the entire village of Southampton are buried there. And we're looking for anything else to give us some clues. Hopefully the map. And a full three-dimensional ground penetrating survey will be done in the future. We'll see exactly what we have. This will give us the opportunity for people to go in there where you can look at a stone and say somebody's buried there. Now you just look at a field. This map will say somebody is buried there. Then we're going to try and see if we can reconstruct the names. And then after we've done that, an appropriate memorial for the site of this particular site will be put on the location because it is of major historical significance. And I do believe this is going to be proved to be the first municipally set aside cemetery in the United States. Next. So, catching up in history. We're going to promote town-wide documentation of grave sites and help establish protocols for discoveries of burial sites. We have found glaring deficiencies in how we deal with the discovery of new burial sites. I mean, there's 48 grave sites. At one time, somebody found it. What do you do? And when you find it, what do they have to do? They have to protect it forever. Can we restore it? It's private property. You probably heard recently when they went back at the Hawthorne property in the village of Southampton, or just outside the village of Southampton, they found remains that were tied to American Indians at that point in time. And as opposed to, what could they deal with? There's no protocol. So they bought the entire piece of property. It might have been just a small area that could have been controlled, but you can't second guess it because there's no protocol. We're helping the town to establish the protocols on how to proceed when they find these things so they don't get lost or buried over because no contractor wants to deal with them. Next. And then this is what we're currently doing. This looks like a lot of things, and it is a lot of things. This is the one corner of West Hampton Cemetery. This is Montauk Highway at this point in time, and we're looking north. 7-Eleven's down here. And not documented. We find that many of the cemeteries in our town, if you had a plot and you want to get buried to somewhere near to your relatives, good luck. If you don't know where it was, there's really no evidence to show where it should be. The maps are not there. If they have maps, some of them are in Rolexes in one person's house. A fire at the wrong spot will blow away 300 years of history. It's not acceptable. So what we're doing, we're taking the guidelines of the University of Pennsylvania. We did in this case. The town established a GIS, a geographic, what's the I stand for? Information system. And they went back and they looked at all these little dots without the numbers. We added the numbers. And to see what was there. Then Julie and I went out, looked under the bushes to see, because they couldn't see it from the satellites, and documented there were actually numbers, actually graves in each one of those things. And we give numbers to them. And lo and behold, we found out in 1902, Lois Ackerley had gone back and done a survey. She did a survey, but she had a map which didn't tie the numbers to anything else. So we now have the Girl Scout, Troop 521. So we now have the Girl Scouts organizing in mass, and they are going to go back and to do a survey of those one historic section of West Hampton Beach to attribute the numbers that were assigned to it to a particular gravestone, and also use whatever information we can retrieve from the past to accumulate that into a single database, which is the Ackley report. And it's a lot easier to use what they saw 100 years ago and then trying to read what it is today. So that's why we want to put it so we don't lose any more. So this is just in process now. But this is not a town-owned cemetery. It's not. But we feel that if we can set in motion for all the other non-town-owned cemeteries a standardized method which is proven throughout the professional society of going back and making a valid way of going back and keeping inventory, we can help preserve and restore these for the future. That's the goal. So this is the first one. From there, we're going to encourage other places to do it. The town's role would be to set the structure in place and then let volunteers come back and follow through. And this will be the repository for all the information which we can have for the families, who in some cases, these stones represent the only single documentation that they existed. And that's it. Thank you.